Hey everybody, and welcome back to my channel. I have a very special episode for you today. The video quality is probably a little bit different, and that's because this episode today is a video interview with a very special guest that I'm very excited that made the time to join me today. I've been having angst about this all week, making sure that I have logistics right, making sure I had the equipment right, making sure I had preparations right, and we'll see how it goes because there's no way to do it but live.
What's the worst that can happen?
The worst that could happen is probably just losing all the data. I guess that's the worst, like having an entire lovely chat and then it just crashes and we can't do it again.
But at least you and I will have had a nice chat.
That's true. It'll be in our memories, and in our hearts and souls. So I am joined today by the venerable. You ever been called venerable before? Is that a word that I can use?
I'm not 100% sure what it means.
Neither do I. I know a lot of words, and I don't know what it means. Venerable means accorded to a great deal of respect, especially because of age, wisdom, or character.
Well, I am getting on a bit, so I've got one out of 3.
That's true. I'm joined today by Rich Harris, the creator, inventor, developer, project lead of Svelte, Dapper, and many other things, frankly. But we can talk about them, but I'm mostly going to be talking to you about Svelte and Dapper because that's what I've been playing around with in the past 2 weeks of my life. Hi, Rich.
Hey. How's it going?
Good. Thank you so much for joining. This is a first on my channel. You are the first special guest on this network channel. Trying not to upsell myself here. The goal of this right now is to have like at least a 20-minute chat, maybe more if we have some good old time chit-chatting. This will hopefully be the least amount. Sorry, this will hopefully be the most amount that I'm talking, and hopefully it'll just be you talking this entire time, because if I'm talking, then I'm doing a bad job of interviewing you. So I'm told. I have a list of questions, but I'm hoping also we can just kind of roll with the punches. My first question is real easy, and it's probably a good one to start with. Who are you?
Who am I? I'm just some guy. I'm a graphics editor at the New York Times. So my background is in journalism, and I do open source stuff kind of as sort of as a side project, but really because it helps me do my day job. I feel like you were trying to get at a deeper truth about who I am.
I am very shallow with all my questions, so you can take it as any direction that you want. I'm actually curious. You say journalism is your background. Was that like a focus in university?
Actually, no, not in university. I studied philosophy at University College London.
I studied philosophy as well.
Right. So it was a waste of 3 years, right? It was just a...
That's why we're developing now.
Exactly. So I kind of graduated from that. And now what? No idea what to do. Went traveling with my girlfriend, now wife. While we tried to figure out what to do with our lives, ran out of money. And it's like, shit, I got a philosophy degree. I'm qualified for literally nothing. Oh, except journalism, because you don't need a qualification to do journalism. So
quite the compliment to the entire industry.
No, it's true. This is one of the great things about it. Anyone can be a journalist. It's not one of these things where, you have to go away and study for several years and become part of some kind of professional guild or anything like that. It's a very open profession that anyone can take part in. And that was, good for someone like me who didn't have any professional qualifications to speak of. So I went back to the UK, enrolled in journalism school, did like a...
Oh, you did?
Yeah, did like a 3 or 6 month course, and then eventually managed to find a job. And then soon after I got that job, I watched half of my colleagues get fired because it was the financial crash in 2008.
Yeah.
And I was like, I've got to try and make myself more employable, because the only reason that I didn't get fired was because I was dirt cheap. They wouldn't pay me anything. But I figured that if I was going to last in the industry, then I was going to need to get a little bit more, indispensable. And so I started trying to pick up more technical skills, partly as a way to do that, and partly because I was very excited and interested by some of the interactive JavaScript-driven journalism that was happening at places like The Guardian and the BBC and the New York Times.
What year was this?
Emulate that. So I started working there in like 2008, and I guess it was around 2011 was the time that I started learning JavaScript in earnest and thinking that that was a thing that I could apply to my job.
Got it. Very interesting. That is wild. They actually went back to school for journalism. That's
yeah. Well, you know,
like
you have. It's better to, you know, you're more likely to get a job if you can say, you know, I know what the libel laws are in this country. I know how the local authorities work. I can write shorthand. You know, all of these things. You don't have to have it, but it helps.
It helps. It's also funny you're saying that journalism, you don't have to have as much qualifications to potentially join journalism, which was my experience also, like by and large for developing as well. Like you have to know the skills, the craft, but there's no like law bar that you have to pass to become a journalist or developer.
And
you just have to.
That's a really valuable thing that a lot of us really cherish, I think.
Yeah. Very cool. I'm gonna keep going from there. So, I mean, you talked about, you know, you enjoy journalism at your full-time job, and you also do open source in your after hours. I'm curious, just trying to get to know you. Anything else that you like to do after hours that's outside of just code, potentially?
I just binge watched the entirety of Game of Thrones.
Wow. And how long? 6 weeks. Wow.
About that. I'd avoided it for the whole run, and season 8 was coming up, and I got some serious FOMO, and so Svelte 3 was released. I had that off my plate, so I just dove headfirst into Game of Thrones. I don't think that counts as a hobby, though.
No, watching TV is definitely a hobby, especially when you watch. It's like what, 80 hours of TV in 6 weeks. Like that is a skill.
It was an undertaking.
Yeah, no, that is just the pure force of will to not leave your cushion. Like, wow.
And I managed to watch every episode right up until the finale, just in time to watch the finale with everyone else.
Oh, really? Like the actual last
That was
episode?
my goal, that I would be able to go into work on the Monday morning and I wouldn't have to put on my noise cancelling headphones while everyone else around me talking about it. And I succeeded. So, you know,
That's
job well
awesome.
done. But yeah, my free time is at the moment is almost all devoted to open source, and it has been for a little while. But now that it's summer here, I'd really like to spend a bit more time outdoors and less time dealing with GitHub issues. Try and instill some open source life balance, which is the new work life balance.
Open source, open doors to the outside. They're all open.
Yeah.
That's the trick. Yeah. I always hear it's like an inbox that never gets cleared, but worse because it's open source. Okay, let me just jump into some Svelte and Sapper questions. Something just might be a little bit obvious to. I like to ask the obvious questions because I'm often surprised at the non-obvious answers. So the first one is, why did you make Svelte?
I made it because, so this is my second run at building a JavaScript framework. I had a previous thing called Reactive, which was me as a very novice developer really trying to figure out what the tool I needed when I was first building interactives on the web was. And I've been maintaining that thing for a little while, sort of tailed off towards the end. And I'd kind of become aware of some of the shortcomings, some of the design flaws that I'd baked into it at the beginning. And I just wanted a clean break. I wanted another stab at solving this problem. And it was around the time that people were becoming very aware of the problem of large JavaScript bundles, and the effect that has on startup performance. And I started to, having spent a bit of time working on a module bundler and also on an ES6 to ES5 compiler, I was in the sort of right frame of mind to think, well, maybe we can solve this problem in a different way from the way that we've been solving it before. Instead of having like a bunch of JavaScript that interprets your application code in the browser, maybe the framework could become this thing that actually converted your application code into something a little bit more vanilla-ish, that updates the DOM in a more, performant, memory-friendly, etc. way. And so, yeah, it was me trying to rectify some earlier mistakes that I had made while I was trying to scratch my own itch and build tools that I needed to do my job.
So it was directly powered from problems you had at work.
Yeah. Yeah, so the Reactive began at The Guardian. Svelte also began at The Guardian while I was working there. I was working on the interactives team. We're building these applications that make a lot of use of SVG and animation and a lot of other things. They've got a lot of interactions. They've got state coming in from all different places, and we need to build them in a very short space of time. Right? We have these pretty punishing deadlines in the news business, and the tools that were out there at the time just weren't really up to the task. So it was filling a gap that I was experiencing in my day-to-day job.
What was the gaps that you saw in those tools?
Well, at the time that I started building Reactive in particular, the best answer that people could give you for the question, how do I have some dynamic data-driven views like rendered to the screen and updated, was, oh, use a template library like mustache.js or something like that. And you just throw some more data at it, get a piece of HTML back, and then like find the right part of the page and then replace the HTML. Or you did everything manually with jQuery, or you had a backbone view which did the same thing but in a more organized fashion. And none of these were particularly satisfying. Then at the other end, because we do a lot of stuff with SVG, people were at the time discovering D3, which is this incredibly powerful framework for doing data visualization. And these two ways of building web apps, the template-driven approach and the more kind of, I don't want to use the word imperative because it's almost used as a pejorative term these days, but the more kind of, you have to explicitly say, this is what I want to happen in response to this event, style of development, these two things were in conflict. And it seemed to me that that was counterproductive if you were building the kinds of apps that we were building.
So you were looking for a way to rapidly develop interactive elements on a page that wouldn't, I guess, what was the issue with using templates?
Well, templates are inherently not good for anything involving animation, because if you're updating stuff at 60 frames a second and you've got this blob of HTML and you say, element.innerHTML equals new HTML, then all of the existing DOM on that page is going to get discarded. And then you've got to create this new stuff. And especially back then, you want to do that at 60 frames a second, you're going to have a bad time. And so it sort of limits the ambitiousness of what you can build.
And this was around 2014, 2015?
Yeah, like 2013.
2013.
So we went back a little way.
So the requirements were something that was quick to create, that supported animations, that was embeddable, and highly customizable. I always do fours like this. I don't know why. It's so weird. I do four, then I get yelled at by someone, and I go like this. So whatever. So the tools at the time around 2013 was D3, which was very much a sledgehammer and also not something that was that agile. I mean, if you learned it, even if you learned D3, you're still looking at the docs to see what you're doing, or you're making abstractions on top of it. And then when those abstractions break, you're having a bad time. Backbone with handlebars or mustache, which again, as you very correctly said, are not great for animations. And then I guess was Angular 1 around at that time?
It was, yeah.
That's not good
And
to embed.
I mean, I looked at that at first and I thought, oh, this is great. This is exactly what I want. And then as soon as I spent a bit of time with it, this is not what I want.
You didn't like to call, apply, and digest on a whole hierarchy?
No, I mean, it just seemed like absolute madness. And it put me off ever touching Angular again. I know it's a very different beast now, but there's still that sort of residual trepidation that comes from having tried it back in the day. But it had this core idea that HTML is the language that we should be using to build these applications in, right? HTML is the language of the web, and we just need to enrich it with the missing pieces to make it a dynamic, data-driven language, rather than the opposite approach, which was being developed in parallel primarily via React, which is that JavaScript is the language of the web, and we should be putting all of our logic inside JavaScript along with all of our markup and all of our styles. So these two sort of parallel but pretty different ideas about the right way to build dynamic web applications. I sort of land pretty firmly on one side of that.
Yeah, that's great. That's great to know. I was talking to a coworker today. We're talking about testing, and I'm trying to like rethink my opinions about it. And I'm like, I'm just trying to figure out my opinion about this. And it's good to have opinions, but it's also good to know why you have those opinions. So I was going to ask you like which of those sides, but yeah, I mean, looking in Svelte, you have these extensions to the HTML language. Like, do you wish that was built in? So to give background to viewers, if you haven't seen the videos, I don't know why I'm explaining this. You should explain this because you wrote it.
So yeah, you have a piece of markup, and you're probably going to have some data that is potentially going to change. Like, very simple example, you've got a counter app, and you have a button that increments the counter. You'll have a count variable that is enclosed in the little curly braces, and that is not an HTML thing. Like, if you just write HTML, then you will have literally curly braces count. In Svelte, that gets turned into a dynamically updated text node. And in that way, you're able to use state in your view in a fairly idiomatic way. And it looks exactly like JSX, as long as you're dealing with text nodes. And you can do the same thing in element attributes. You have constructs for doing conditional markup, and you have constructs for looping over a list of items and having, a set of li elements or whatever it is. And that's pretty much it until you get to the point where you're encapsulating stuff inside a component and then reusing that in other components. That's sort of all that you need to learn. It turns out that you don't need to add a lot of stuff to HTML to make it into a very complete, very powerful, very flexible and composable language for building dynamic apps. There's actually less to learn going from the HTML side, adding this additional logic, than if you're going from the JavaScript side and you're adding something like JSX into your JavaScript.
I buy that argument. Would you want to see those constructs, those additional attributes that Svelte's aware of, be something that maybe not in that exact form, but have it be something that's built into the browser?
I struggle with this a little bit. I'm not so sure. There is actually a proposal at the moment that I think it's called the template instantiation proposal or something, that's being championed primarily by the Polymer team, I believe.
That makes sense.
And I look at it and I assume that it's the way it is because if you're doing something as a proposed standard, then like you have certain constraints that mean that you can't pick the best aesthetic choice or the most usable choice, right? You have to have the choice that satisfies all of these additional constraints that something that is part of the platform has to have. And the result is something that I, for one, will never, ever use and will never recommend that other people use. And it's conceivable that it would be useful to a framework developer like myself.
Oh,
like it's something that could be in the platform, and maybe we translate the nice component authoring format that actually makes sense to users, and we turn it into this thing that the browser can deal with very efficiently, possibly. But it's the way that it handles scoping and things like that is, if it was 5 years ago, then it'd be like, yeah, this is fantastic. This is exactly what we need. But it's not, right? We've got frameworks like React, like Svelte, like Vue, all of these other things that give us a really nice way of building interactive apps, and no one wants to go back to this situation where you've got all of these weird scoping rules to learn, and you've got to wrap everything in double curly braces because apparently a single curly brace isn't enough. All of that stuff. I can't get excited about that. So yeah, I think that the browser probably has other bigger problems to solve. Like I think that as framework developers, we got this. You can go and fix things like, I don't know, payment permissions, or stuff that lets me build a image editing application or a media player like Spotify completely with web APIs, right? All of that stuff, please give us that. Template instantiation, we're good.
Very cool. Yeah. I mean, my question, which might be out, which I think I already know the answer, but is, even philosophically, would you want these things to be built in?
There's always a danger when you do that you sort of encode the wrong ideas about how things should be done, and they become this calcified part of the platform. They essentially become technical debt, right? If you don't get them right. If you get them right, fantastic. But I feel like we're still learning a lot of things about the best way to build web applications. And if you encode the wrong things, then you could easily get it wrong. Like a case in point, we added a thing to the Svelte template language maybe like a year or a year and a half ago. We call it an await block, and it allows you to use a promise directly inside your template. And before that, it had just never occurred to us that would be a useful thing, but now it is, and people use it all the time. Right, so if you take our idea right now as a snapshot of what should be in the platform, then what innovations that would have come down, a year, 2 years down the pipe, are you then going to miss out on because you were too eager to standardize things that are actually still in flux?
So there's a big advantage of leaving these things to the user space.
I think so, yeah.
And freedom.
Yeah, and gradually you do kind of discover things that the platform does need to provide. A good example would be the React team's work on scheduling. Right, they're doing this stuff in userland, but they're also having conversations with platform people inside Google and inside Mozilla, I believe, about what a platform level scheduling API would look like and what it could give you beyond what you can do in userland. And that's I think what the relationship should be like.
So there's more value in putting into the browser things that are, if not, maybe not impossible, but they don't belong in userland. And it's one of those things that you kind of know it when you see it, type of thing.
Yeah. Yeah, like there's a proposal out there. I haven't seen much movement on it lately, but it's a proposal for a syntactical construct that allows you to create inline web workers. It's called blocks. Have you seen this thing? It's like blocks, but the O has an umlaut because like there's already a thing called blocks, so they call it blocks. And it's great. That's the sort of thing that I would use all the time if I had it, and I cannot do it myself. I mean, I guess you could with some very clever transpilation and whatever, but that's the sort of thing that would really make a lot of our lives easier and enable us to do these new things. Whereas, when people say build React into the browser should have the virtual DOM natively, that misses the point by such a wide margin. It's not even funny.
Like, historically, I think the only thing that has, of all the JavaScript libraries, frameworks, that has really ascended to the browser, as far as I know, I'm sure there's other ones, but the only one that's the most famous is just Sizzle.
Yeah.
Like, which is document.querySelectorAll. Like, I don't know of any others that have truly ascended.
None spring to mind. I mean, I guess you could make a case that some of the array prototype methods.
But that's just utility methods, just like with blocks. Is that how you say it? Blocks?
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 Yeah, but things like array index of and stuff like that. Like that was that in prototype JS before it was in ES5.
I mean, I wish I had been more awake, like more, I guess, just a coder when prototype JS and mood tools was around, because I feel like I'm missing out on a part of history that I'm only very incidentally aware of. I remember just coming to companies and being like, oh, mood tools, that's old and busted. Use jQuery, that's the new hotness. Like, that was the thing in like 2010, 2011. And it's just funny that it just goes around in circles.
It should.
Is there any like thing that you want in the browser that you're dying to have for Svelte?
Nothing springs immediately to mind. It would be nice if we had a way of importing HTML into the browser in the same way that you can import a JavaScript module. It would be cool if you could import a fragment of HTML and have that.
It's a proposal, isn't it?
There was a proposal years ago, HTML imports. It was part of the web components family of proposals.
Right.
But then Mozilla were like, we don't want this. And so it died a death.
Well, that's sad.
And I don't know if there's some idea to reanimate that proposal, but
I guess you call it more of it's more of a deport than an import.
Right. Yeah, so that stuff would be good. There's a library called FastDOM, which enables you to interleave your DOM reads and your DOM writes in a way that prevents the possibility of layout thrashing. And I would love to see that be in the platform, although I'm told that it makes more sense to build that on top of the scheduling primitives that are being added. So I don't know.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, having more control over browser lifecycle methods.
Yeah.
In a more declarative way, which is the new way of saying everything's great and nothing can ever be bad about declarative XSLT. What other questions do I have? I guess also, so you made Svelte. It's you use that, I guess, at work.
Yeah.
You're happy with it, I imagine.
I mean, no. There's I've been working on this thing for the last 2.5 years. So I'm probably more aware than anyone of its flaws and deficiencies.
Do you ever bite your tongue when you see somebody using a feature that you're like, I don't trust that?
Yes.
Do you want to share what that is?
One example. I've thought this a little bit. The idea of being able to pre-process components so that you can use things like Sass and less inside your style blocks, or you could use TypeScript in your script block, that kind of stuff. And I just had this feeling like, oh, this is going to cause problems. But it was such a popular thing that, like, okay, instead of like literally supporting Sass and less and everything, we will build this preprocessor API that will allow people to do that themselves. And then all of a sudden it's a plugin platform. Right? and then you've got to think about how these different plugins interact with each other. And then you've got to think about when you install a linter that is aware of Svelte components, how does it know what to do with the strange non-CSS syntax inside your style tag? And so many of the questions that we get in the support channel of our Discord server are, how do I get it to work with this combination of post CSS configurations, and it's oh god, just use the built-in stuff, and then you just won't have any of these problems.
Do you have to deal with those issues, or is there community members that work on that part?
I am extremely fortunate to be part of a community of very helpful and dedicated team members. It's actually a really great community around Svelte. It's one of my favorite parts of the project is, we have this Discord server and we just kind of hang out there, and it's like the bar in Cheers, like everyone kind of knows your name, and it's nice. Although I will say that since the launch of Svelte 3, the activity in that room has reached almost unmanageable levels. And I, for one, between Game of Thrones binging and my day job requirements, I haven't been able to give as much attention to that server as I would like. And we're starting to think: is there a better way to surface previous answers to similar questions and that kind of stuff? But it's a nice problem to have.
Yeah, no, I hear that. I feel like your Game of Thrones binge was like your cure to burnout from the Svelte 3 push. That's
kind of it. Yeah, it was a big push to get that done, especially because at the time I was preparing for this conference talk in Israel that I did in the beginning of April, and I wanted to have stuff ready for that, and I wanted to do a good job of the talk itself, and there was also a lot happening at the Times back then, so all of these things just kind of piled on, and I was just wiped out. So yeah,
it's never one thing. It's amazing.
No,
like when things happen, you're like, oh, there's 5 stressors. Why?
Yeah.
And I'm sure you also wanted to announce Svelte 3 at the conference, so that was also.
I did, yeah. And it wasn't released by then, but it was a few days after that, and so by the time they got it up on YouTube, it was out. So that was good, and it was really nice actually, because it meant that the launch announcement could have that conference talk video embedded in the blog post, and that meant that people who wanted to know more about the framework, they could read the video. People who didn't have that much time, they could just read the blog post. And we had like the learning material set up. So like whatever your style of learning about stuff or discovering stuff, we had all the bases covered. And I'd also just recorded a podcast episode with Una Kravitz and Chris Danaraj, who do the Tools Day podcast. And so it was like the best executed launch that I could possibly have hoped for.
That's impressive. Like as a developer, I struggle so much with marketing. So having that outreach and having that success is, I do applaud you in that.
Yeah, marketing is it's so important and it's so difficult, and I hate it. But there we are.
What's the time check? Does this tell us how long we've been talking for? I feel like we've been talking for a good time. I can keep going, but what are the things? Oh, here's a fun one. What is your current? Well, you might have already answered this actually, but what's your biggest regret of Svelte right now?
Ooh, good question. Biggest regret. I mean, I can certainly tell you what I think the biggest gaps are at the moment, apart from some of the missing pieces of documentation that we really need to get around to sorting out. The biggest thing I think is probably TypeScript support, which is surprisingly, I think, the #1 requested feature. And I think that's probably
the lack of support.
The lack of, the lack of TypeScript support. So inside your Svelte component, you have a script tag, and that's where the logic for your component goes. And you have to write JavaScript. And I mean, you can write TypeScript and you can pre-process it, but you won't get any of the benefits of code completion. You don't get type checking. You don't get auto completion inside your markup. If you import the Svelte component into a JavaScript module, you don't get the type checking for the component API, all of that stuff. And that'd be nice to have, but it means fiddling about with the TypeScript API and digging into the guts of things like VS Code to figure out how all of that stuff happens, and it's slightly above my head, but it's a very popular demand these days. A couple of years ago, I don't think anyone would have cared, but now it's like one of the first things people ask when they're evaluating a new library or framework. It's like, how good is the TypeScript support?
I don't even know what that would look like, having type checking in a template.
You would get a red squiggly if you had an object or like something that could be undefined inside your curly braces or something like that.
Well, like in a template, aren't all attributes strings? Or no, I guess you have the curly braces so you could put integers.
Well, if you think about like an each block where you're iterating over a list, you want to check that the subject of that is an array-like object, that kind of stuff.
Oh, speaking of the lists and if-else things, what was the process in deciding on that syntax?
Initially, it was just stolen from like handlebars and stuff like that. They always have the £sign opens a block and the reverse slash closes a block, and we just used that because it was pretty widespread, well understood. Even all of the other mustache-like template languages have something similar. And then for Svelte 2, we got rid of the double curlies in favor of single curlies, and at the time we thought it would be good to think about the rest of the template syntax a little bit, and so we had this epic GitHub thread with literally hundreds of comments where like every man and his dog came along and said, oh, how about this? And eventually we just decided that this was the route that we wanted to go. We experimented with some more JavaScript-y constructs, but surprisingly they didn't really make sense. And so what we've ended up with is something that we think is a good balance between familiarity and something that actually captures the semantics of the markup a bit more cleanly than more JavaScriptish things would. Like having ternary expressions, for example, it's all well and good, but you can't see the structure of a component at a glance that uses ternaries very heavily the same way that you can if it's using if and else, just because of like the way that the indentation naturally flows and things like that. Plus, it means we can start doing things like you can have each list as item, and then you can have an else block for the each, which is what gets shown when the list is empty. And there are things like that that you can't have if, and these are useful features that people use all the time. You can't have that if you're queuing very closely to JavaScript.
Are any of those constructs your, like, in terms of the programming ergonomics, like the experience of using them, like, do you have any favorite of those and any like least favorite of those?
I do kind of like the await syntax, even though I don't use it a whole lot, just because it simplifies something that everyone has to deal with asynchronous data at different times, and I don't think many frameworks have something analogous to that. I guess the stuff that I really like is the stuff that's close to my heart is the stuff around transitions and animations. So the fact that you can do transition : fade on an element, and then when it gets removed from the DOM, it will gradually fade out before it gets removed. And then if the state reverses while that's happening, it will smoothly fade back in. Stuff like that is very useful if you're building stuff rapidly. And again, it's stuff that you can only really do if you have a well-defined template syntax.
I'm going to have two more questions because I think we've been talking for a good amount of time. One that I'm personally curious about, because Svelte's from my point of view, a very fancy, complicated piece of machinery. So I'm very curious to know what steps you not necessarily had to take, but that were part of your journey to being capable of writing a thing of this nature.
rewriting it in TypeScript was one of those steps. Actually, the compiler has been through a number of rewrites since we started it. It's one of these things that kind of grows, you know, funky limbs and has to be trimmed down every few months, like a sort of gnarly tree with these outgrowths, and you need to.
Well, it's like a monsoon.
Need to apply a bit of tree surgery.
Yeah, no, you have to whack the weeds and pull the plants.
Yeah,
that's an expression. But the compiler is all AST stuff, right?
Yes. So when you give the Svelte compiler the source text of a component, it will split that up into the script and the style and the markup blocks. And then the script it hands off to Acorn, which parses it, gives us an ES tree AST. And there's a project called CSS tree, which does the same, but for CSS. Gives you a very similarly shaped AST. And then we have our own parser for the markup because we have our own directives and stuff that isn't handled by off-the-shelf HTML parsers. And then we take those three things and combine them in various ways, traverse over them, find out things about the component, about which values it's using, about which things can be mutated and which things are going to be fixed. And then once we've gathered all that information, we spit out some code.
I think my battery in my camera's dying. That's how long we've been talking for. You can even see it because I'm just using a thing. So if it dies, I'm just going to switch to my webcam. But my last question is, what is your 2-year plan for Svelte?
We need better tooling. We need better editor integrations. We need some kind of dev tools. We need that TypeScript support. Sapper needs a lot more work. I think it is potentially a really good way of building applications of all sizes. It's not there yet. It has some rough edges, particularly around the CLI, but I think it has the bones of a really good way of building stuff. Although there's some really fancy stuff that people are starting to explore now around incremental hydration and components that hydrate when you interact with them, and a lot of these sort of new ideas that I hope that we can adopt. Some of the stuff that the React team is playing around with suspense, I think is potentially very exciting, and I want to steal that. And my own thing at the moment that I'm quite excited about is Svelte GL, which is a way of describing 3D scenes inside a Svelte document.
Yeah, fancy.
Yeah, so it got its first public outing last weekend when we published a thing at the Times, like a WebGL spinning globe thing with ships that travel around it. And I want to keep on working on that because it means that I will be able to do 3D graphics a lot more easily than I've been able to in the past.
That's awesome. Rich, thank you so much for taking the time to join me and chat with me about Sveltes. Thank you everyone for watching. Hopefully you learned some new things that you didn't know already. And if you already knew everything, then you're probably Rich Harris, which is weird. That's you, Rich, now watching this video at a later point in time. That is a comment to your future self. And that, yeah. Game of Thrones was such a long time. With that, I'm going to end this before my camera dies, and all you see is the blackness of night, just like the wall in Game of Thrones. Whatever. And I will talk to you again next week, the new video, and sadly without Rich Harris, because he has things to do. Bye, everybody.